Great stories are timeless and they'll last forever. So at BioWare, we try to make that the heart of what we're doing.
You know, you really bond with these characters, you remember them, you remember the story long after you've played it.
This isn't just a story that I want to tell, it's a story that is to be discovered. It's interactive narrative.
As we start designing the next Mass Effect game, we start by asking fans what they want, you know, what Mass Effect means to them. One of the things that fans have told us most about what they want in the next Mass Effect game is to go somewhere new and to move forward.
New places, new characters, new people to fall in love with.
We're taking you to a whole new region of space.
This world is so vast that you can just kind of continue on to the horizon. There's more and more experience for the player to enjoy.
Pick a planet across the other side of the galaxy and fly there and see what you'll discover.
Imagine what we can do now with the power of new consoles and amazing software.
It all looks fantastic.
We've never seen these characters this real before. We think fans of the series are going to be surprised at just how far we're going. While the Montreal studio is working on the next Mass Effect game, our team here in Edmonton is developing a completely new IP.
Welcome back again, folks, to part 2 of our ongoing look at the life and death of BioWare Montreal, the developers behind the critical and commercial flop that was Mass Effect Andromeda. Last video we focused primarily on their early formation and first real solo project, that being the development of the Mass Effect 3 Omega DLC, which, like Andromeda, received a mixed reaction by fans, a troubling sign for things to come. In this second part of my ongoing series, we're going to focus primarily on the actual full development timeline of Mass Effect Andromeda. As I said in the first part, we will eventually get to a critical analysis of Mass Effect Andromeda as a game and how it compares to past titles under the BioWare brand, including specifically the original Mass Effect trilogy. But, as I've said, we aren't simply here to tear apart Mass Effect Andromeda, but try and understand why we received the game we did. How did a once great series, considered the very pinnacle of sci-fi and a flagship franchise for AAA publisher EA, turn it into an internet joke and frequent topic of hate amongst fans and players? Once we have a better understanding of how and why Andromeda turned out the way it did, we can then move on to properly critiquing its many shortcomings. Unfortunately, this second part of my series will be the one most focused on my own pure personal speculation, based on the facts I've been able to gather from various sources. Again, I've tried to keep my speculation supported by as many objective facts as I could find, but at the end of the day, it is still pure speculation. Until someone from Montreal gives a full inside story into the development of Mass Effect Andromeda, speculation is all someone like myself can rely on. That said, I will be providing sources to all the facts I list in this video, so you can make your own conclusions from the same set of facts as I did. One of the primary sources for this video will be the Kotaku article written by Jason Schreier, who attempted to get an inside account into Andromeda's development troubles. Thus, without further ado, let's take a look at the development of Mass Effect Andromeda, from its early stages of pre-production all the way to its release in 2017. As far as I've been able to find, the actual planning for what would eventually become Mass Effect Andromeda began soon after Mass Effect 3 wrapped up in 2012. According to Kotaku, in 2012 a work on Mass Effect 3 came to a close. A small group of top BioWare employees huddled together to talk about the next entry in their epic sci-fi franchise. Their goal, they decided, was to make a game about exploration, one that would dig into the untapped potential of the first 3 games. Instead of visiting just a few planets, they said, what if you'd explore hundreds? In early conversations throughout 2012, a team of directors in Montreal brainstormed ways in which to make the next Mass Effect feel distinct. This group, which included several veteran BioWare employees, as well as Hudson, who wanted to help guide the project through its infancy, had lots of fresh ideas for a new Mass Effect. There'd be no Reaper threat, no Commander Shepard, they could pick a brand new area of space and start over. Their goal was to bring back what Mass Effect 1 promised but failed to deliver, which was a game about exploration. It's at this point I want to stop and point out something interesting I noticed as I read about the early days of Andromeda's development from various sources, and maybe you've already caught it. The interesting bit being, I can't find any sort of creative lead or director working at BioWare Montreal at this time, and thus driving the team's efforts for the new title. What do I mean? Well, games like films tend to gravitate towards the auteur theory, that being that the final product of these particular pieces of entertainment are ultimately the responsibility and typically the brainchild of one individual or at least a small key set of persons. As a result, the quality of the final product, for better or worse, is typically laid solely at this individual's feet. In film, we know this to all to be the director. Whether it be Michael Bay, Christopher Nolan, Ryan Coogler, Kathleen Bigelow, or Adam Sandler, we know their names and either heap praise or lay scorn at these individuals at each subsequent film they release. Now, obviously, no film is made simply by one person. A film is a complicated piece of art that demands the collaboration and involvement of various different fields and disciplines in order to craft a singular, finished product. Cinematography, lighting, audio design, screenwriters, actors, stunt coordinators, stuntmen, producers, makeup artists, costume design, animators, and you get the point. All of these various departments, comprising of hundreds of individuals, are necessary in order to create a modern blockbuster film. Yet, following the auteur theory, we ultimately attribute the success or failure of any film to the director, not any of the other 100+ individuals that worked on the film. This is because we accept the idea that a director is the ultimate boss of a film. He/she usually has the final say of what does and doesn't get put into a film. He or she gets to change the script, approves the costumes, chooses the soundtrack for the film, picks the actors, works to develop the cinematic style of the final film, and anything and everything in between. Games, similar to movies, tend to follow this same format. While publishers and even certain developers themselves wish to downplay the role of any super key individual during a game's development, the reality is clear. No piece of entertainment product, hell, no company, could survive without there eventually being someone in charge at the top. Someone who has the unique power of the final word, that being the power to ultimately say yes or no. In modern game development, we recognize those names as Hideo Kojima, Ken Levine, Jonathan Blow, Cliffy B, Amy Hennig, and Neil Druckmann and Bruce Staley, to name a few. These individuals are the powers behind some of the biggest gaming franchises, whether they be Metal Gear Solid, BioShock, or Uncharted. Similarly, these same individuals can be found at BioWare, with names like James Olin, Casey Hudson, Mark Dara, and Mike Laidlaw. These are the names behind titles like SWTOR, Mass Effect, and Dragon Age. The importance of a creative director, or whatever their analogous name is at any gaming company, as sometimes they're listed as the executive producer, cannot be stressed enough, as they are typically the ones that, at the very beginning of a project, drive the vision for what the game will eventually become. The original Mass Effect, for instance, is the brainchild of Casey Hudson. This is a fact that has been repeated time and time again. As the story goes, he met with the BioWare founders for lunch at a Greek restaurant, where he laid out his vision for an original sci-fi BioWare RPG following the success of KOTOR. This new IP would be heavily influenced by sci-fi from the 70s and 80s, drawing visual inspiration from the artwork of individuals such as Sid Mead and a soundtrack reminiscent of Vangelis' Blade Runner.
I put a few notes on paper, and Greg and Ray and I had a meeting over lunch at a Greek restaurant near here, and we just talked about the high-level ideas of what this kind of game should be, and you know, some of the fantasy of the games that we loved that we wanted to try and recapture. You know, for me, it's games like Starflight, going back to 1986. Games like Deus Ex with, you know, there's shooter stuff, but there's skills to it, and you know, so we talked about these kinds of things, and ultimately we gave ourselves a rough framework, but it really took probably a year or more before we really had a handle on what it was.
We really still remember the time when we started talking about Mass Effect. It was after we'd done Knights of the Old Republic, and after, you know, that was such a Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic was such a tremendous success, and you know, there's a lot of passion that went into that game and a lot of really great ideas. And we were sitting, Ray and I were actually chatting a lot with Casey in those days, and you know, we were sort of thinking about, okay, what's next? What's the next thing to tackle? And I think what we really wanted to do was to blow it out. We wanted to do something of our own. I think that was the other thing that really came out. And it was funny, we were at this, you know, I think one of the first meetings was at this Greek restaurant by our old office. I still remember us talking about it and like throwing the ideas around. So it was a really, you know, it's always exciting when the game is starting, because it's pretty general, but there's usually some really neat ideas that still, to this very day, have kind of lived through all that time or in the game itself.
The things that came to mind is, for myself and the art director, Derek Watts, there is kind of an entire genre of art, like kind of futurist art, that was especially done in the early 80s and late 70s, where things are they're just extra sleek. They kind of have a graphic design sense, or even like an aerospace design sense to them. They look like they're drawn with a compass and a ruler, and you get these very functional but very sleek looking designs. And so that was something that we wanted to impart to Mass Effect.
At the beginning, Casey and I really sat down, talked a lot about what kind of movies we liked, what kind of artists we liked. Sid Mead popped up. Some of the other movies we liked was Solaris, Nick Clean Style and that. Red Planet, a lot of the other Hollywood things like that.
Curiously, despite all my painstaking research and the numerous articles written about Andromeda's development, I can find no story similar to that of Casey Hudson forming the basis for the original Mass Effect. I can't locate any story in which a sole individual pitched the concept for what Mass Effect Andromeda would idealistically be. Rather, the article by Kotaku specifically states that it was a team of directors in Montreal who brainstormed ways in which the next Mass Effect might feel distinct. That sounds all well and good, but any product developed by purely a committee is going to come out looking like Homer's future car, which is to say not very pretty and of no use to anyone. At the end of the day, someone has to be able to finally say yes or no to any particular idea. Further, it should be this individual that drives the ultimate passion for what the game will become. Now, I don't want to make it sound like a creative director is some authoritative dictator that demands his vision of the game be meticulously followed and crafted by his underlings. Well, I mean, sure, that likely exists for some games such as Metal Gear Solid or BioShock.
小島監督は大きな決断を下した。
サニーの声取り直そうか思ったんですけど、ブレイフィングの位置とるだけ1時間ぐらい取れる。よくなりますかね。マジで？マジで？
サニーの音声を一部再収録することにしたのだ。だが、今から音声データを変更することは大きなリスクを伴うことになる。
この時期に撮り直すっていうのは普通あるんですかね。
ないと思います。初めてです。
いろんな部分に影響が出るというか、作り直しが起きたりとかっていうのも結構あるんです。それでこの時期にそこまで制作の過程を戻すのは結構大きいことなんですけど。
しかしリスクの大きさを一番感じていたのは監督自身だった。
この時点でこんなことするのはおかしいんですけど、そういう判断です。ちょっと今回悲壮感のあるお話なので、その中でもちょっと光るような、3人に変えた方がいいかなと。
Most directors or producers in a game mainly drive the creative talent of their whole team. They certainly have their own ideas of what the core game should be, but they are there to better push the collaboration of the whole team, to take all their ideas and craft a single game out of all of them. Mass Effect may be Casey Hudson's brainchild, but he relied on individuals like Drew Karpyshyn, Rob Blake, and Derek Watts to help create the full world through their input. But, at least for the first year of Andromeda's pre-production, I can find no individual that fit this role. Instead, it appears the team was just wildly throwing out ideas for the next Mass Effect without any clear singular vision of what a Mass Effect 4 would be. This seems to be confirmed by the same article, which details these early concepts. One early idea was to develop a prequel to Mass Effect set during the First Contact War of the series lore, when the humans of Mass Effect's galaxy had interacted with aliens for the first time. In late 2012, Hudson asked fans if they'd prefer to see a game before or after the original trilogy. The answers were resounding. Most people wanted a sequel, not a prequel. The feedback from the community, focus groups, and the team working on the project was the same. We wanted to do a game set after the trilogy, not during or before. So, BioWare changed course, ditching the prequel idea. The word Contact stuck though, and that became the code name for the fourth Mass Effect. What this tells us is that in the very early stages of the development of Andromeda, there was no clear vision of what the next entry should look like. There was no Casey Hudson sitting in a Greek restaurant laying out his vision for a new sci-fi world. Instead, it appears to have been a directionless, free-thought experiment where everyone and anyone, including fans, could offer their ideas as to where the next entry in the series could go. I strongly suspect that this early lack of direction is one of the many reasons Andromeda ended up feeling so disjointed by the end, and it will be a pattern we'll be seeing repeated as development for the game continues into its next few years. But, for now, we can close off this year of pre-production with the knowledge that at this point in time, Mass Effect 4 had no guiding vision for what the ultimate game would become. Now we know from Kotaku's article that Andromeda had entered pre-production by 2013, and it's at this point Andromeda finally gains a creative director, with Gerard Leone being tapped to lead the new title itself. Which, itself, is an interesting choice. Leone's past couple years had mostly been spent directing the Spider-Man titles for Activision. I think this odd hire alone needs to be analyzed for a number of reasons, because it could speak to the internal studio problems we'll see as development pushes further on. At this point, Andromeda had been in pre-production for a number of months, if not a whole year, and rather than promote someone within BioWare Montreal to the creative director position, EA chose a complete outsider, one who, while may not have had any real experiences developing an RPG or even critically acclaimed titles, one who did have experience actually shipping large AAA titles under time and budget constraints by a demanding publisher. It can't have been easy shipping what were essentially movie game tie-in products that were even halfway decent given the time and budget allotted by Activision at the time. So, it's with this choice, we have to speculate as to whether even this early on, EA could tell that Montreal studio was simply too inexperienced to be trusted on their own to ship a full AAA game. After all, one would think there were other talented individuals within Montreal that could have stepped up to fill the big seat. For instance, there was Fabrice Cardamanias, the senior producer who was previously in charge of shipping the Omega DLC, which we talked about in my last video. Secondly, there was also Mike Gamble, at this point a senior producer who had worked in the series since Mass Effect 2. Yet, when it came time, EA decided to bring in someone completely outside the company to head the new Mass Effect. Again, we can only speculate as to why this was. Perhaps individuals like Fabrice or Mike Gamble didn't want to step into the director's chair. Or it could be interpreted as an early sign of EA's lack of confidence in the Andromeda team. A year into pre-production and the series still had apparently no real driving vision. I think that perhaps they felt an individual like Gerard Leone could provide the level of structure and vision that was lacking from the team at the time and hopefully get the team back on schedule. In a twist of fate, it would seem that Andromeda's pre-production woes were actually exacerbated as a result of hiring Leone. The Kotaku article mentions that he was the one that formed the basis for the idea of traveling to a new galaxy searching for a new home, but that he also wanted to have hundreds of explorable planets all procedurally generated. Now, it doesn't take a genius to realize even back then, before the release of No Man's Sky, that this kind of system simply wouldn't work with the type of game BioWare typically makes. BioWare is about telling tight stories, in which the player can roleplay. It's next to impossible to tell such a story when the player has hundreds of planets out there to explore. It simply isn't possible to generate the kind of meaningful story content fans would expect on such a scale in such a time frame. Yet, this appears to be what the team smashed their heads against the wall trying to achieve for 2 whole years, from 2013 to 2014. Quoting Kotaku, the Mass Effect Andromeda team was also having trouble executing the ideas they found so exciting just a year ago. Combat was shipping up nicely, as were the prototypes BioWare had developed for the Nomad ground vehicle, which already felt way better to drive than Mass Effect 1's crusty old Mako. But spaceflight and procedurally generated planets were causing some problems. They were creating planets that they were able to drive around in, and the mechanics of it were there. I think what they were struggling with was that it was never fun. They were never able to do it in a way that's compelling. We're like, okay, now imagine doing this 100 times, or more times, or 1,000 more times. Needless to say, the final product appears to be littered with the fallout from these early concepts. The most common complaint with Andromeda is that the worlds often feel far too big and barren without any real meaningful content between the vast stretches of open spaces. It should be noted that Leone also really led the writing team at this time, pushing his own ideas for what he wanted to see in the story. While it's unclear at this point what were all his original ideas, we do know certain things like going to a new galaxy and a companion AI stuck to the player were with the game from the start. However, we can't be sure how these concepts ended up changing as high-level staff turned over as development started to ramp up. Finally, we can't end our section discussing pre-production without mentioning EA's Frostbite Engine, which according to many sources was a real headache for the team to learn as they began development of the game. When EA developer DICE completed their brand new Frostbite Engine to use for their Battlefield games, EA had the wonderful idea to take the engine and demand its use for all future EA titles. While the decision itself isn't completely without merit, it's clear looking back that Frostbite was simply not as versatile of an engine upon its initial rollout, one which could support the vast variety of games that EA itself published, from shooters to RPGs, racing games, and sports titles. These same headaches would be echoed by the Dragon Age Inquisition team around this same time. And, looking back at Dragon Age Inquisition, we can see the developers' frustrations with the engine in the final product. For instance, many of Inquisition's dialogue scenes are done without a traditional cinematic camera BioWare titles are known for. While the developers have admitted that part of this was an experiment for a more relaxed dialogue system, they've also appeared to admit that this was a result of their limitations with the Frostbite engine at the time, which seemed to eat a lot of resources when it came to these scenes. Curiously enough, despite coming out 2 years after Dragon Age Inquisition, Andromeda would end up relying far more on this essentially cheap dialogue system as opposed to the more traditional cinematic camera for the majority of non-essential dialogue scenes. Once again, I can't help but see this as the inexperience of the Montreal team. Where the Edmonton team on Inquisition had managed to mostly work around their problems with Frostbite, the Montreal team seemed completely swallowed up by them, incapable of overcoming the very same obstacles that Edmonton managed to overcome 2 years before. But pre-production would turn out only to be the start of Montreal's problems as the years moved on.
Has it been a more nebulous development cycle than previous Mass Effects or previous BioWare games, do you think?
Oh, yeah. The development cycle on this one very much maps to Mass Effect 1. Again, when we did Mass Effect 1 back in 2005, 2006, a decade ago now, a lot of the stuff we had there, new engine technology, we were one of the first outside developers to use UE3 at that time. We were reshaping the entire IP, right? We had this idea of building a kind of a space opera RPG, but other than a few of those words and some ideas in people's heads, there's just an enormous amount of work to translate that into actual gameplay and an experience. Mass Effect Andromeda, obviously we have more confidence in what we're building at that point. However, we switched to Frostbite. This is our first Mass Effect game on Frostbite. We did want to spend a fair bit of time lifting over every rock and going back to the original vision documents for Mass Effect and saying, what did we really want to achieve with this original game, or even the trilogy, that we didn't because of, again, time constraints or budget constraints, or just the technology. We can't do it on this generation of hardware. So we spent a fair bit of time of that, and so that did create ambiguity for sure. We incubated a new leadership team to do this one. The original Mass Effect leads, many of the original Mass Effect leads, ended up going on to start our new IP, which is in development, and so we wanted to support them in doing that. So we had to grow up a new set of leads. Luckily for us, many of them were people who'd been senior developers on the original trilogy, who now just had to take on more responsibility and step up to the plate to do that. And by the by, they've done all that, which is great.
As we move into 2015, we begin to see the real cracks in Andromeda's development and have to start to speculate on the culture and work environment inside the development studio as the team begins to bleed talent at an alarming rate all the way into 2015. As our article states, several people from the team described 2013 as one of the best years of their professional lives and 2014 as one of the worst. Whereas 2013 was full of possibilities for the developers of Andromeda, 2014 was full of politics. This makes sense from the perspective of anyone that's worked on any sort of group project. The initial planning stages are the easiest and most fun. However, once you and the team actually have to do the work you've been talking about, things start to get more complicated and often frustrating. Right near the start of 2014, BioWare in Montreal began to lose senior talent. In August of 2014, Casey Hudson leaves BioWare. While he was focused on Anthem at the time, he was still providing some level of guidance to the Andromeda team. After all, the Mass Effect series was his baby. The bigger blow comes not long afterwards when Gerard Leone also departs the project. These are the two most senior people you can expect on such a project, and both are departing as the game should be leaving pre-production. Once again, we have to note the replacement for Mr. Leone. EA/BioWare decided to bring over a longtime lead Mass Effect writer, Mac Walters, to fill in the creative director role. Prior to this, he was working on Anthem with Casey Hudson. Again, EA chooses to place someone outside the Montreal team to head up the project. This again should speak volumes as to their confidence in the Montreal team. One would think the simpler solution would be to promote someone already familiar with the vision and development team of the game. someone who had been working about 2 years on the game at this point. Instead, they chose to bring over Mac Walters, a sign to me that says they had zero faith in the Montreal team and the vision they were attempting to execute.
I'm really curious about like the development history of this game, because Casey Hudson, when he finished 3 as creative director, did he move on to this, or was he immediately on to new IP? How much of this vision is Mac's, the new creative director's, versus Casey's?
That's a good question. Just to think back, the setting and everything was done when Casey was still with us. That was all locked at that point. I would say Mac and the production team and the leadership team on Andromeda get full credit for realizing what was originally set up as a vision statement. That we're going to take a bunch of people to a new galaxy. We're going to go to Andromeda, and you're going to tell a story in Andromeda, and then from there. Those guys took, yep, that's our plan. Let's do that.
Yeah. Was it always Montreal? Were you always incubating that talent in Montreal, knowing that Mass Effect eventually is going to shift over there?
Yeah. We've had Montreal in the studio family for 6.5 years. I want to say now 6. Maybe it's coming up to 7. But the idea, even while Mass Effect 3 was still in development, was the leadership team on the trilogy would move on. By choice, you know, they had done this game for almost 10 years at that point, so they decided that they wanted to do something different. And Mac's a fellow who had spent some time on the new IP, but then decided, no, my actual, there's still more I want to do with Mass Effect, and given the opportunity to be creative director, he did that. And then other folks like Mike Gamble, he was a producer on ME2 and ME3. He's still a producer on Andromeda. And then you see a ton of new folks. Like that, and Yannick, our studio director in Montreal, he was on the original Mass Effect 1 game as our development director. So it's really a mix of talent and things like that.
With the new inclusion of Mac Walters to the team came a completely new vision to the game, mainly scrapping the clearly unworkable procedurally generated planet idea. However, before 2015 ends, we'll see several other senior leads on positions most important to the game up and leave the studio. Eric Chartrand, the lead designer who was with them since the Omega DLC, leaves at some time during pre-production. Chris Wynn, the senior development director, leaves near the end of 2015. Chris Schlurf, the lead writer, leaves mid-2015 to join Bungie, and Cameron Harris, the senior editor, leaves by early 2016. Note, these are only the big-name public departures we know about, the ones that made the press at the time. Who knows how many senior leads and other key staff also left during this time? The Kotaku article cites dozens of staff leaving or transferring to other projects. The best we can do to guess is to look at those individuals that worked on the Omega DLC and those that remain by the time Andromeda rolls out. And of course, through this comparison, we can see quite a few individuals either left after Omega or at some point during Andromeda's development. Now, if this were a few departures early on, this could be looked over. But this many senior leads leaving the project all around the same time speaks to a pattern and thus begs the question. What the hell was going on in BioWare Montreal? When you look at how many people left the project, it's hard not to understand why EA sought out someone outside the original development team like Mac Walters to bring the project back on schedule. For whatever reason, the original team simply could not work together effectively. As a result, we close off 2015, a time when the game should be in deep production, gearing up for its at the time 2016 release, with a string of senior departures and a new creative director attempting to bring a new, more manageable vision for the game.
Fans have seen headlines of like, oh, development director left, writer left, what's going on here? And now we're hearing that, Austin and Edmonton are helping out more and more with Montreal. Was that always the plan, or has there been kind of a shift to bring in more talent from the other studios to kind of corral this thing?
More the latter. We're lucky that when we're all in the same company, we have some operational flexibility to go and have people help out. That wasn't the original plan. When you look at the challenge of trying to hire people, trying to get people into studios, it's sometimes easier to say, okay, well, we have this group of people here who are talented and who want to learn Frostbite and do these things. They're in Austin, let's put them on there. Or we have Edmonton developers who have a ton of expertise on Mass Effect. They can go in and solve some of the challenges that just makes more sense to have them help solve than to hire people and do all that kind of thing. So no, not the original plan, but a credit to the team. They make it work, and I think they make it work because at the end of the day, everybody loves Mass Effect, and everybody thinks that this is going to be a great game. So they roll their sleeves up and they get in there and they go do it.
Quoting staff from the Kotaku article, almost every video game goes through some sort of scope change during development, as designers and artists start sacrificing their babies in order to ship the game on time. But Andromeda was unusual. Typically, a massive rescope like this would have happened during pre-production, so the developers would have time to pivot and plan things out before starting to build the game. If there's one thing that should have happened in hindsight, the cuts that were made should have happened earlier, said one person who worked on the game, so there would have been less of them. I think in general, the team tried too hard to execute a game that was not doable.
And, it's funny, I think we've said this before, but, one of the observations Mac and I were making with a few others while we were chatting about this one night is the funny thing about Andromeda for us, as some of the people who've been at BioWare for a long time, that took a little while to get our heads around was new people to the team would talk about the game and say, well, I want to do this, I want to accomplish this, I want to do this, and we'd be like, wow, that's really interesting, great, okay. And we heard it enough that we started to go, where's this coming from? Like this, it's a beautiful energy people are bringing to this project. There's a lot of really interesting things. And it turned out when we actually started to talk about it more, it was coming from a place of these developers were first fans of Mass Effect back in the day, and then they became game developers. And so we sat down with some of them, we talked to them, and what Mass Effect meant to them in their heads was so amazingly different than what it meant to us, because sometimes we get bogged down in the realities of making computer games, right? How this is a job and how this is, and it was super refreshing to talk to these younger developers, and now they're contributing and they're wanting to take it in all these different amazing directions. You're going, well, okay, great, but let's look at our schedule here. Let's look at this, and they're going, but, and then you realize, oh, you're doing this because you have this incredible ideal for what Mass Effect could be for a new generation of fans.
Despite the departures, it appears as though Mac Walters brought much needed vision and structure to the team by all accounts, actually getting the game to ship instead of stuck in development hell. As the article mentions, it wasn't just the writing. Almost every Andromeda developer who spoke on this story said the bulk of the game was developed during that final stretch, from the end of 2015 to March 2017. Most of Mass Effect Andromeda was made in just a year and a half by those accounts. It really wasn't until Mac Walters came on board, and that was very much a reaction to the state of the critical path, he was really brought on board to give it direction and get it into shape. Before that, it was quite rudderless. Some at Montreal saw the directorial shift as Edmonton trying to take over their game, while some at Edmonton saw it as them needing to come in and rescue it. Now, I don't want to spend too much time at this part, as it's pretty well covered in the article. It's during this final period that we know that almost all departments were behind by the time Mac came on board and changed the scope of the game. Of course, the writing team was the most far behind, still focusing on high concepts like the relationship between Sam and the player, as opposed to actually writing the bulk of the game. According to the team, they spent more time simply trying to hold the game together than actually polishing it as released near ever closer. Instead, I want to focus on the actual public view of the game as released came ever closer. For a long time, Andromeda was held back from the public, with 2 whole E3s passing by without any sort of gameplay reveal or showcasing. Our first real showing of any gameplay of Andromeda came at PlayStation's PS4 Pro event, and its lackluster showing is telling. Instead of showcasing a dialogue or story-heavy quest, the demo is focused mostly on platforming. The player jumps on various platforms in what appears to be some sort of alien vault, stopping to scan various objects. We then end with a cutscene that is completely out of context for any viewer, and then that's it. I think this first real showing proves the report in the article, that the team really was that far behind. They clearly had nothing ready to show even as late as 2016. By the time we got our first real gameplay slice in December, fans were foaming at the mouth for any sort of real gameplay showcase, and yet, what they were finally treated to was a demo full of technical glitches and wonky animations, another warning sign of the things to come. While the derpy rider disarm animation received the most public reaction, I found that other technical glitches appeared to go unnoticed. For instance, the Atlas mechs losing textures when they appear in the demo. This of course sent the leadership team on the defense, assuring fans that those animations and technical glitches would be polished up by the time of release. Of course, we now know they never were and never could be in that time frame. This final period was simply spent trying to ship something out the door from a title that had lagged behind in development for 5 years. At that point, the longest a BioWare title had been in development. Think about that. Mass Effect Andromeda took more time to develop than the massively multiplayer online game that was Star Wars: The Old Republic. It's not any surprise that EA wanted this game out the door as soon as possible by 2017. Technical bugs be damned. While we know that BioWare Montreal was closed down following the release of Andromeda, I strongly suspect that EA had planned to close the studio, if not seriously restructure it, long before the release, regardless of the reception of the game. The game took too long and likely cost too much money for a franchise that had never been a mega seller. But before we close off this section, I want to note something odd I noticed when the credits finally rolled in Mass Effect Andromeda upon completing the game, which in my opinion further reinforces the development hell that was this game. Almost every BioWare title prior to Andromeda starts its credits with the creative director / executive producer of the project. Mass Effect 3 starts with Casey Hudson alone, listed as the project director. Dragon Age Inquisition, a game that came out only 2 years before Andromeda, and one where Aaron Flynn was still the general manager of BioWare, lists Mark Darrah first and alone as the executive producer. Now, look at Mass Effect Andromeda. Instead of the creative director, who at the time was Mac Walters, being listed first, it's the general manager Aaron Flynn and studio director for Montreal, Yannick Roy, who are listed first under the title Project Leadership. What this tells me is that individuals like Aaron Flynn, the individual responsible for overseeing all of BioWare, had to be more directly involved in the development of Mass Effect Andromeda than any past title. So much so that his name is placed before any creative director or executive producer. In comparison, Aaron Flynn and Yannick Roy don't come up as names until far late into Dragon Age Inquisition's credits under their respective job titles of General Manager and Studio Director. This simple change in credits, in my opinion, speaks volumes. And with that final note, we come to our close at our look at the internal development timeline of Mass Effect Andromeda. I hope you enjoyed this little look inside the development studio behind Andromeda. With this second part done, we now have a much firmer grasp on the internal problems and disputes that occurred within Montreal that ended up affecting the game we would eventually receive. Armed with this understanding, we can finally now begin to analyze and dissect all of the problems associated with Mass Effect Andromeda in my next set of videos. I don't know how many videos it will end up being, because it might take a while to discuss all of Andromeda's problems. I might just do one long video or break it into parts depending on how long it gets, but we'll see. The next video may take a bit longer as a result though. As always, feel free to let me know what you thought of the video below, and if you liked the video, give it a like or whatever, but thanks for watching. In any case, see you next time.
Presenting the car designed for the average man, the Homer.
Any questions? What does this monstrosity cost?
Jerry, what's the sticker price? That
$82,000! This monstrosity cost $82,000? What have I done? I mean, the zoo was fun, but I'm ruined!